I'm Nelson Spencer, Chairman of the Waterways Journal and President of the Pott Library. And I don't want to take away from what Sara's going to say, her tribute to Donald Wright. So I'm just going to give you a brief background on the history of the award. Named for Donald Wright, obviously. He was a publisher of the Waterways Journal for 45 years. It's a biennial award, first hosted by Southern Illinois University in 1975. It's moved to the Mercantile Library in the 1980s when John Hoover was curator. And it was moved here to help revitalize and refocus the award as a means of recognizing bodies of work that contribute significantly to a better understanding of the American inland waterway. Past participants have included a National Book Award nominee by name of Earl Swift for a book called Journey on the James, a Pulitzer Prize winner Ron Powers for his book Mark Twain, A Life, John Hartford, Gentle on My Mind, Post-Dispatch cartoonist Dan Martin. Dan here today? No? You all know him. Pulitzer Prize winner David Grunfeld. He did a series of photos on Hurricane Katrina that were fantastic, remarkable. Watercolorist David Anderson, historian Carl Kramer, and many others. Mr. Wright was a steamboat enthusiast as a young boy growing up in Oil City, Pennsylvania. He bought the Waterways Journal with the help of his father in 1921 from a man named William Arst. Arsty and Arst. So we'll go with Arsty. And the weekly trade publication had been in existence in St. Louis as the River since 1881, struggling to make it from year to year and undergoing several ownership changes. The railroads gave it fits, couldn't compete. So Mr. Wright had been a regular contributor over the years, and he was a character. He, as owner of the Waterways Journal, he would ride his bicycle from Webster Groves to where he lived, to get off in downtown St. Louis and then ride into the chemical building at 8th and Olive. He'd take his bike on business trips and was said to have been the first person to ride a bike over the Huey P. Long Bridge at New Orleans. Another idiosyncrasy was his penchant for writing news items on the backs of carbon papers of letters that he had written. And once the story goes, he forgot to cross out the letter. And when the galley came back from the printer, it contained the letter, obviously, and not the article, which ended up actually costing him more money. There are many stories about him, but his accomplishments far outweigh them, where he was a staunch supporter of everything having to do with river navigation. And he'd hit the road for months, stopping and talking to everybody, and he wrote numerous articles, obviously, about the river. He had quite an influence in that day and age. He died on Thanksgiving Day, unexpectedly, of a heart attack in 1965 at the age of 71. James B. Swift Medal, also awarded biannually by the Pott Library, commemorates the memory of a gentleman's first byline contribution to the Waterways Journal, which was in 1941. He worked at various times during his 60-year career, 60 years, as a columnist, advertising manager, business manager, and vice president, and was best known for his old boat column, which today, written by others, is still one of the Waterways Journal's most popular columns. His sizable collection is being organized now at the library. And he himself was awarded the Wright Award in 1989. He crossed over the bar in 2002. So that gives you a little background on the awards. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sara.
Thank you so much, Nelson. My name is Sara Hodge. I am the curator of the Herman Pott National Inland Waterways Library here at the Mercantile, and I'm also the special collections librarian here. Today, we're here to recognize two people who have made recent contributions to the long and outstanding legacy of American river literature. The Donald Wright Award is named after a man who in many ways, and if you wanted to go ahead and cue up the PowerPoint, that'd be great, thanks. The Donald Wright Award is named after a man who in many ways did more for river literature than any other person of the 20th century. He was the editor of the Waterways Journal for 45 years, as well as a riverman himself and a fierce advocate for the development of our nation's waterways system. I could easily spend the next 30 minutes talking about this incredible man and his contributions to river literature, but instead I want to explore the history of that literature and Donald Wright's place within it. Rivers in St. Louis. The two words go hand in hand. Just saying them aloud leaves the listener with a comfortable sense of companionship, a feeling of rightness and belonging, understandably so. For thousands of years, the rivers in this region have defined the lives of the people who've lived alongside their banks and down their tributaries. From their transportation to their recreation, from their agriculture to their communication, even their cultural and spiritual practices. Two of the greatest American rivers, the Mississippi and Missouri, as many of you know, border the land where the modern day city of St. Louis sits. The Missouri River is the longest river in North America. It flows 2,341 miles from its headwaters in Montana to its confluence with the Mississippi in St. Louis. The Mississippi River Basin is the fourth largest drainage basin in the world. It covers more than 1.2 million square miles and 32 states, which is the equivalent of about 40% of the continental United States. Today, the Mississippi watershed provides drinking water, food, and jobs to millions of people around the world. Yes, St. Louis is a river city down to the marrow of its bones, and has been since its founding, and across the thousands of years and communities that called this land home before. But we understand comparatively little about those early communities and their relationship with waterways before the written word was brought to this region by European colonizers. Archaeologists and historians have to piece together narratives from scattered material remains using massive earthen mounds, copper plates, and shell-timbered ceramics. They weave tales of great empires, sprawling trade networks, urban centers, and humble farming communities, with rivers serving as the lifeblood of each. The Mississippi and Missouri don't appear in print until the late 17th century. I'll direct your attention to the screen up ahead where you can see this print that I'm going to be talking about. After La Salle's, they don't appear in print until the late 17th century, after La Salle's exploration and conquest of North America and Marquette and Joliet's journey down the Mississippi. The latter pair kept a detailed journal of their voyage, which they published in 1681. Here we can see a second edition printing of their map that appeared 8 years later in a rare German book by a Franciscan monk, Louis Hennepin. Hennepin was part of the La Salle expedition, and his book is one of the earliest travel adventure stories of North America. His publication was a bestseller at its time. While it provides one of the earliest firsthand accounts of the Mississippi and its neighboring communities, it's important to recognize his text was also filled with misleading and ignorant characterizations of the indigenous people. Although negative, these characterizations are still critical primary source material that provide insight into the dynamics between native peoples and the European colonizers, and how the river coursed through the center of it all. Hennepin's book and map are both on display in our anniversary exhibition on level 2 in the Americana First Gallery. If you'll forgive the pun, these expeditions were a watershed moment for river literature. The 18th century saw a steep increase in publications examining and documenting the region's rivers, such as this translation of LePage de Pratz's 1758 travel narrative, The History of Louisiana. De Pratz lived for 16 years in the land the French unjustly claimed as Louisiana and wrote a 3-volume, 1,300-page account of the area and his experiences. His work is among the first known descriptions of the flora, fauna, geology, geography, and native peoples of the lower Mississippi River Valley. Here we have another 18th century publication, Jonathan Carver's 1778 narrative, 3 Years' Travels Through the Interior Parts of North America. Carver's Travels was one of the most widely read adventure books of the century and contains descriptions of Carver's observations and experiences along the upper Mississippi River in present-day Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. Much like de Pratz, on these 2 pages displayed here, just these 2 pages alone, we can read Carver describing the native cultures, flora, fauna, geology, and geography of the region. I was so impressed how he could cram all of that in on these 2 pages, let alone the rest of the book. By this time, American river literature was blossoming. Publications continued pouring from the region into the 19th century. There were still government-sponsored topographical and hydrological surveys and expeditions, including Lewis and Clark's famous river exploration narratives. But as more people made the journey westward, river literature began to evolve. Where once it sought to educate and enthrall the distant reader, now it sought to aid and guide the wary traveler. The 19th century saw an abundance of atlases, gazetteers, national guides, and immigrant directories. The guide literature documents with remarkable detail the infrastructure of the rapidly expanding country, including the birth of the steamboat, construction of canals, roads, and railroads, and even the development of the postal system. In 1801, Zadok Kramer, a Pittsburgh printer and bookbinder, began publishing The Navigator. He originally intended it as a handbook for Western immigrants, but it quickly became a sacred text for rivermen trying to navigate flatboats and keelboats down dangerous and ever-changing waterways. The publication was based on travelers' journals and reports and included directions for navigating the Monongahela, Allegheny, Ohio, and Mississippi rivers, and descriptions of nearby towns, villages, harbors, and settlements. Kramer regularly published revised editions. The 5th edition, published in 1806, included crude woodcut river maps on a scale of 12 miles to the inch, with channels, islands, tributaries, and towns all marked. Anecdotes of people and events and descriptions of flora and fauna are scattered throughout the text, along with the occasional moral or religious observation. Later editions even include advice on where to purchase boats, the best seasons for traveling, advice on how to tie up boats overnight, and the best places for embarkation. The publication was widely popular at only $1 each, and it ran through 12 editions until it was discontinued in 1824. The Navigator was succeeded by countless other river guides, including the Ohio and Mississippi Pilot, published in 1820, and Samuel Cummings' Western Navigator, first published in 1822, and then revised over the next 30 years under the title Western Pilot. Also in 1848, George Conklin published his guide, aptly named The New River Guide. I could keep listing them, but I think you get the idea. So why the sudden explosion of river guides and pilot books, you may ask? Well, 2 little events happened. First, in 1812, the steamer New Orleans made history as the first steamboat to navigate Western waters, traveling from Pittsburgh down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans. And then in 1817, the Zebulon and Pike steamed its way up the Mississippi River to St. Louis, throwing open the floodgates of westward expansion. Over the course of the next century, St. Louis thrived at the heart of America's waterways industry, alongside other river towns like New Orleans and Cincinnati. Newspapers reported the comings and goings of boats. Travelers placed notices thanking captain and crew for a particular steamboat trip. Small river columns sprang up in various papers sharing river news across the country. Expedition notes and geographies continue to be published, like Henry Rowe Schoolcraft's Scenes and Adventures in the Semi-Alpine region of the Ozark Mountains. These publications continued to fan the fervor for the West, but in the 19th century, we also start to see prose, short story, folklore, and humor emerge. The Crockett Almanacs were first published in 1835 and ran for the next 2 decades. No, they weren't written by Davy Crockett, but they did feature tales and myths of the American legend. They were actually published by dozens of authors in cities all over the country. The almanacs used Crockett as a narrator to tell amusing tales of life in the backwoods. They feature short essays and biographies alongside dynamic woodcuts of Crockett and his neighbors. As rivers were such an integral part of American culture by this point, they make frequent appearances as the setting and even the subject of the stories. Early issues are characterized by a folksy humor interspersed with factual and informative material, though later issues become darker and feature more aggressive humor and racist rhetoric. Here we see a story about Mike Fink, also known as the King of Keel Boaters, who was a legendary brawler and river boatman featured extensively in early American broadside ballads, dime novels, and other pre-Civil War literature. Fink appears as a frequent character in the Crockett Almanacs. In this story, he attempts and epically fails to scare Crockett's wife by wearing an alligator costume. One positive theme I enjoy from the almanacs is that women are frequently depicted as brave, cunning, and powerful, not to be trifled with. John Hinton Carter of St. Louis worked as a riverman for 20 years before launching a postbellum journalistic career. He wrote under the nom de plume Commodore Rolling Pin. The name was a reference to his steamboat galley experiences. He published a number of novels, poems, and collected works that centered on river life. His stories paint exciting and humorous scenes of rivermen on the Ohio and Mississippi. No conversation about the development of river literature would be complete without mentioning Mark Twain, though I promise not to dwell. Twain, of course, was the pseudonym of author Samuel Clemens, who grew up in Hannibal, Missouri on the Mississippi River and later studied as a cub pilot under several larger-than-life rivermen, most notably Horace Bixby. Rivers came to dominate much of Twain's writing as both setting and subject. From his early river publications in Harper's Monthly Magazine to his 1883 Life on the Mississippi, which provided readers a humorous and romantic cultural history of the river that had captured his heart and captivated his mind since his youth. The book earned Twain his first recognition as a serious writer and romanticized American waterways in the hearts of people across the nation and globe, a feat it still achieves with readers today. By this point, serious river historians had started documenting and recording the waning American river culture. One such example was published in 1889 by Emerson Gould, called 50 Years on the Mississippi, or Gould's History of River Navigation. It spans from the introduction of steam-powered ocean vessels to the first steamboats on the Hudson, Delaware, and Ohio, to the navigation of the Western rivers, and eventually the decline of the steamboat age. It also includes biographies of early rivermen and descriptions of steamboats with information on where and when they were built. In the late 80s, a trade paper known as the Waterways Journal was started in St. Louis. It failed after a few years, but the idea was picked up again as The River, with its first issue published on August 29, 1891. The paper was published by River Publishing Company with Abbott Beach as the editor and business manager. A year subscription cost $2. An editorial comment in the first publication provided the paper's statement of purpose. The river makes its bow to the steamboatmen of the western and southern rivers and announces that it is now on watch. This paper has been started in the interests of the steamboatmen and will be run in their interest exclusively. It will be our object to furnish river news from all the principal cities of the western and southern rivers. We profess no politics and do not care who is president. We have no axe to grind and care nothing for any kind of news except river news. The first story in the paper was about Will S. Hayes, a legendary poet and riverman of Louisville, Kentucky. Advertisers included packet lines, pilot societies, steamship agents, and steamboat painters. The river discontinued on March 12, 1892. For a few weeks, there was no paper until on April 9, 1892, it was picked back up again as the Waterways Journal. The Waterways Journal published its first issue with Abbott Beach as editor. Like the River, the first issue offers a statement of purpose. The policy of this paper will be antagonistic to nobody. Politics will not be tolerated. All we want is a fair chance to make an honest living by confining ourselves to giving the news, and trust we may be successful in that line. The address was listed as a wharf boat at the foot of Pine Street. Beach left the journal in 1893, and then President R.J. Greninger ran the paper for the rest of the year, then suspended the publication in December. It wasn't until April 7, 1894, that it was revived by William Arsty, who purchased the journal at a self-reported, ridiculously low price. Arsty had been a draftsman surveyor turned printer, but had no waterways connections or experience. The journal struggled in his initial years, but he slowly built a vast network and subscription list and stationed agents in several major river towns to solicit subscriptions and advertising. Arsty ran the paper for the next 25 years, never failing to publish an issue, even through the decline of the steamboat and wane of river traffic. His obituary read, "Mr. Arsty traveled more than 200,000 miles on steamboats on the Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio rivers, and their tributaries while he was publishing his magazine. In this way, he became acquainted with many steamboatmen on the rivers in this part of the country." On January 1st, 1921, Arsty retired and sold the paper to Captain Donald T. Wright. Captain Wright, and here we can see Captain Wright sitting at his desk in the office of the Waterways Journal. Captain Wright was born in 1894. He was a native of Oil City, Pennsylvania, as Nelson said earlier, and grew up along the banks of the Allegheny River. The river, like so many before him, found a permanent grip on his heart at an early age and never let go. After graduating high school, he became a cub pilot on the Pittsburgh and Cincinnati Weekly Packet, followed by a clerkship on the steamer Joe Fowler and then the Morning Star. He served in, and this is one of the photographs that were just recently donated from the Waterways Journal. I like to think that perhaps this was collected. This is an original albumen print, so I like to think that perhaps this was collected by Donald Wright from his time on the Morning Star. I don't know that, but I'd like to think that. He served in the Army during World War I at Camp Lee, and when he was discharged, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers placed him on the U.S. snag boat Kentucky. Wright went on to earn his master and first-class pilot licenses. During this time, he had also been a regular correspondent for the Waterways Journal and even took a journalism class in Kentucky. So when Arsty announced his retirement and the journal's sale in 1921, Wright leaped on the opportunity thanks to a loan from his father. At the time he purchased it, it had 350 subscribers and was a dying publication. Under Wright's direction and leadership, he grew advertising and news coverage and increased subscriptions by more than 1,400%. As river columns began to disappear from newspapers and river literature celebrated the days of a bygone era, Donald Wright kept the Waterways Journal very much alive, reporting on rivers and rivermen of the present while still celebrating the past. Wright was a hard worker and aggressive leader. Once each year, he visited every major town and city on all the navigable streams of the Mississippi system. He spent his days selling advertising and gathering news, and spent his nights in hotel rooms writing ads and stories. Wright was a champion of many river causes dating back to his childhood. Between 1913 and 1917, when he was just 15 years old, he was named Boy President of the Allegheny Valley Improvement Association and was named Honorary President in 1941. For many years, he was chairman of the Bridge Committee of the Mississippi Valley Association, and at the time of his passing was co-chairman. He was also a founder, former president, and an honorary life member of the St. Louis Propeller Club. Wright was a fierce advocate for canals and dredging and an even fiercer adversary of low water bridges. He traveled the country giving speeches and fighting for the preservation and enhancement of U.S. waterways, appearing before a number of congressional committees as a witness. Wright was also a student of river history. He was known to say that the rivers of our country are the highways of history. Over the years, he amassed an outstanding collection of river books, documents, pictures, boat models, and other river ephemera and memorabilia, much of which is preserved today in the collections of the Pott Waterways Library. The Waterways Journal recently donated a large collection of their books that had been collected by Donald Wright. I really enjoyed as I got to explore each of these books and open them. I found many notes inscribed to Donald Wright from the authors, begging him to please review their works. I found letters in them. It was a wonderful peek into the life of river literature at the time and how a book really wasn't complete until it had Donald Wright's stamp of approval. Any serious river author, regardless of genre, sent their work to Wright to be reviewed. He was also a major contributor and scout for the Steamboat Photo Company, and built one of the largest collections of steamboat pictures, particularly pre-Civil War images in existence. He spoke at historical societies, including the Mercantile and the Missouri Historical Society, our neighbor across the way, libraries and venues across the country, delivering papers on the age of steamboats and river communities. I would be remiss if I talked about Donald Wright and didn't mention his other love, which, like rivers, dates back to his youth, bicycling. He was a familiar sight on St. Louis streets, riding the same Ivor Johnson bicycle his father had given him in 1910. Wright died suddenly and tragically in 1965, and the journal was taken over by H.N. Ray Spencer, who passed the mantle to his son, where it currently rests. From the hundreds of articles he wrote, to the papers he delivered, to the books he collected and reviewed, Donald Wright was as integral to the development of river literature as he was to the development of rivers themselves. He took a failing trade magazine and breathed new life into it through sheer force of will, a little grit, and a lot of determination. Under his guidance, the journal thrived and came to be the industry paper for rivermen across the country. Like Kramer's early guides, for many a riverman, Wright's Waterways Journal became a sacred text. And for still others, reading its latest issue was a pastime and form of entertainment, much like the Crockett Almanacs and Commodore rolling pin pieces. 200 years of river history and literature coalesced into this one publication, which featured geology and geography, humor and prose, history and navigational guidance, all with Wright at its head, collecting, preserving, advocating, and always, always writing. Wright's contribution to the history of river literature is cemented in time as a foundational block upon which all future works will be built. And the story of his success is apparent as his journal continues to thrive today under the dedicated current leadership. Thank you for listening and for the opportunity to explore this amazing subject with you. I won't take any questions now, but there will be an opportunity after the event to ask questions. You can find me in the atrium, where we will also have snacks and drinks and an opportunity for mingling. For those of you attending remotely, please feel free to send me any questions by email at shodge@umsl.edu. Now I would like to invite Director John Hoover up to introduce the award recipients and present the awards.
Thank you so much, Sara. I stand here so pleased to think about the 50-year partnership that the Waterways Journal has had with the Mercantile in making this institution the crucial stop for any serious investigation of river history, something we just heard. And of course, to hear a talk about all those rare books, it really warms the heart of an old rare book librarian. So thanks very much. And I was just sort of thinking too about how the Wright Award sort of came here. One day, it was a fall day nearly 40 years ago, but an echo from Donald Wright occurred. With Jim Swift was always in my office when I was the first river curator. Before it was the Pott Library curator, before the Pott Foundation, the generosity started from the foundation to help the Mercantile build the river collections with the Waterways Journal. But Jim Swift came in with Ben Lucian Berman, who'd written so many river books, humorous river books that were sort of the successor of Mark Twain, Rooster Crows for a Day, many 1940s texts, 1950s texts. He was still writing them all the way to the 1980s. And Ruth Ferris and Frederick Way, the great Delta Queen captain and a frequent writer to the Waterways Journal. And right then and there, I thought, with Jim sort of prompting me, Nelson, that we need to do this more often with authors and celebrate them. And so that was an important day in the first Waterways Library downtown. So it was it's nice to hear those stories and to remember all of that, and it bodes well for the future as we continue to grow. I'm so honored today to be asked to bestow the Wright Award to a man whom I've known through my entire career at Mercantile. He was a mentor, an advisor, and a friend throughout that long period. And indeed, my first day on the job drove me out to meet one of the collecting pillars of this library, Ruth Ferris. I feel a friendship began with that drive across St. Louis, that pretty April day, and in 1984, and it never really stopped. Tom Grady has had a distinguished legal career here in St. Louis as a busy judge of Missouri's 22nd Circuit Court for years, and indeed the presiding judgeship of at the culmination of that tenure. He has been a tireless advocate for historic preservation and served as a guiding force for the Mercantile's Board of Direction, and was the first president of the Herman T. Pott Inland Waterways Library when the Pott Foundation endowed this institution. When he came to me to publish the last St. Louis Riverfront, I was amazed at the manuscript, the meticulous notes, and the enthusiasm which went into this important book we honor today. It's already sold out twice, and so we're working on a third edition. That never happens in cultural institutions. So we're it's a wonderful circumstance in and of itself. Tom had been thinking about this subject for many years, and to see his work in print, documenting what we have poignantly lost, and in this often chaotic quest for the progress and redevelopment, is a revelation and a gift for generations to come. So please welcome Thomas Grady to accept the Wright Award from all of us, his friends and colleagues, and to say a few words this afternoon. Tom?
I appreciate the kind words, John, and I appreciate the award from the board that has agreed to it. I want to acknowledge some very good people that are here today. Also, my fellow awardee, David Lobbig, who's a great scholar and historian and enthusiast, and from the Missouri Historical Society. I have to say that that day he's mentioning about visiting Ruth Ferris, the reason I think I was brought along is that Ruth was deaf, and the timbre of my voice carried through, and she couldn't understand a word that John was saying. She understood everything I told her, and so God bless her. This book, and I won't be long, was long in preparation, 5 years or more, and it is testament to the fact that the Park Service must have been, I know no other explanation, embarrassed at what happened on the river, because they've been charged so often with preservation, not with destruction. And I think they were chagrined, and they didn't want to see this book printed. On the other hand, their sense of duty led them to cooperate with me and pull out all of the files from the federal condemnation court. And that's why we have these pictures. It's almost
funeral home, had collected all these things and then was hiding them. They weren't really hidden. They were in a little room in the old courthouse, which had about 3 or 4 publicly supported employees who rather quietly sat waiting for you to visit. There were a few visitors. Anyway, I am grateful to that staff as well. And of course to John Hoover and the Mercantile Library staff, incomparable help for this exercise in creating a compendium. I had always hoped that it would not be too boring because there are so many buildings that were destroyed, and any number of them really could have been hotels that you would see in New Orleans today, and would be full and fascinating buildings. It was not what this creature Johnson from Harvard says it was some sort of an ethnic slum. I don't know where he's getting his information from. No, it wasn't. But the real estate interests wanted these buildings down because it was providing very small rent cost for the occupants of these warehouse buildings and light manufacturers. They didn't want that. And the mayor of St. Louis, Bernard Dickman, who in many ways did many good things, Barney, he was a friend of the real estate. And so that's one reason these buildings went down. And it is not the fault, I have to say, of Eero Saarinen, who designed the remarkable Gateway Arch and all that sort of thing. Wish they would have found another place for it, but it really wasn't his fault. And we can't even blame the Silver Prince, Walter Gropius, the man who gave us a cheese grater architecture for America. It wasn't his fault either. I thank you so much for this award, John, and members of the board. And I will cherish this the rest of my life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. And congratulations once again from all of us. I've been blessed to know many great friends always in my career with the Pott Library and the Mercantile, certainly, all the way back to Tom, who we just heard from, and beyond, and when I started downtown, where there were enthusiasts of the river everywhere. Scions of the last steamboat captains could often be met on the street in those days. On special days, if the Delta Queen were in port, you could hear a steamboat whistle booming up to 4th Street. And Jim Swift seemed like an impresario downtown in his love of the river and his love of the Mercantile as the waterway's true historical home of many memories that we've created here. Today, to receive the Swift Medal, which bears another departed friend's name, is a man who is one of my newest river friends, David Lobbig, who, as a fine environment curator of the history of our region, wrote the curatorial exhibition notes for the exhibition Mighty Mississippi at the Missouri Historical Society, an exhibition which was underwritten in part by a strong financial and curatorial collaboration with the Mercantile Library and the Pott Library, and those collections that are here. Everywhere in that program, David's work as curator of environmental life was in evidence, and his collaborative work with the Mercantile's curatorial staff was a joy to behold and bodes well for future collaborations with that institution. David's overall work in developing exhibitions, tours, presentations, articles, and publications relative to the environmental history and ongoing situation of the St. Louis region deserves more appreciation and recognition. And he has worked tirelessly in regional ecological science and as it relates to our special waterways history and necessities. He was board president of the Missouri Coalition for the Environment, where he helped to shape water, farm, and racial equity policies to advocate for the region's environmental protection and preservation. David, in his historical work, makes the region's water history come alive in the context of our backdrop riparian homeland. And that would be of great pride to Jim Swift. We now bestow the James V. Swift Medal for river writing and documentation to David Lobbig, who will say a few words.
Can we get one more?
This is one of the special thing about the back of the medal is Jim Swift's booklet. But you'd like to have that too. So thank you. I'll put it on. Thank you.
I'm absolutely thrilled and deeply humbled to be here to receive this. I received a letter several weeks ago notifying me that I was to be the recipient of the James V. Swift Medal, and really quite stunned. And now we're here. Thank you. I don't know if John remembers, but we met back in the 1980s. I was a student at Washington University, and you were working stacks and downtown, the beautiful, beautiful library that's now here. But it is definitely an honor of the highest order to receive this from Herman Pott National Inland Waterways Library. And I'm without words really to express my gratitude. So that message, it came at completing 9 days of disassembly for the Golden Eagle Pilot House. Some of you might remember it was on display in mighty Mississippi at the Missouri History Museum. And I'm filled with sadness by that action, but also hope, because of that intensely hands-on period with the pilot house, which has now been carefully crated and trucked and stored for future study and exhibition. I'm discovering still more intimate details of the structure and its mechanisms. This work, along with the award, highlights the joy of helping to preserve and interpret our vital shared river history. I look forward to somehow continuing to provide new and revealing chapters about us and our river. For anyone to contribute anything, but distortions or detours from the truth about the river's magnificence poses a worrisome challenge. Why bother your time attempting to throw more light on that beautiful, constant, life-giving tide sweeping past our doorsteps, ever and anon crushing us back to realization with by its awesome power with a well-placed flood. Though many have prosaically exposed various facets and histories, we can't do better than what can be observed in its own expressions. Go be with the river. By the time it reaches St. Louis, its lands gather up waters from nearly 700,000 square miles around, gravity sending the channel flow to its southern gulf, showing the Earth's greatest oceans what we've been up to. Not just metaphorically, but a material, biological, and chemical assessment of the health of inhabitants, land, and water. The message always flows through a slow, steady telegraph, 1,250 miles and tens of thousands of years long. It communicates from our place, here at the confluences, where the river graduates from adulthood to godhood. With a grade shallower than a Walmart parking lot, the river somehow never stops, forcefully and inextricably proclaiming that this land is its land, and our little cities and towns with busy lives merely a part of it. A person is forgiven to wonder if there's anything they can intelligently contribute to that greater truth. We seem small and insignificant. By the river's powers of sustenance and glorious timelessness, amnesty should be granted for all of us to go on with our lives of leisure and distraction. Our mindfulness might be granted a respite. We might finally sleep a few more hours and return refreshed and without responsibility to the river. We must all try a little. I think of a friend who was in a profoundly thoughtful moment several years ago. After a long day, our family sat restfully eating with him on McLeod's Landing. And we looked up as he pointed abruptly to ask, "Where does that go?" You can imagine where you are on McLeod's Landing. More than 20 years of his residency here, and he still had such a question. Anyone can be absolved for ignorance of the bridge piers, which are not swept downstream because in 1870, Grafton's Mississippi limestone was wet to bedrock some 100 feet below. And knowledge that the bridge maker, though only an honorary captain, was a river creature through and through. And probably only due to that can we now admire those 3 elegant 140-year-old spans of 8 tubular steel arches in their intended location today. 3 pairs, I meant to say. There are 3 pairs of arches. That the east abutment sits on land which only 20 years prior to commencement of the bridge had been successfully reclaimed by city engineer Henry Kaiser and a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers lieutenant, whose later traitorous racist exploits disqualify him from being mentioned by name here. He's recognized now by the absence of his statues in certain southern cities. And that the East Bank only remains tamed from its impulse to help the river run wild again, due to the Corps' perpetual river training efforts. We really should all know, however, that the river's vast and fertile American bottom, floodplain, extends for miles along and out from the river on the side opposite St. Louis's high ground. And that here, the river is the Mississippi. Not all people know that. We might laugh at my friend's limited observation now, but we all have a little learning to do about rivers, divorced as we are from them today. What Ede said about his bridge is true of the river, that people would have it exist as long as it is found to be a practical application and useful. The river is a hell of a lot more than practical. We need it like we need water. I finally became aware as a young adult that daily, excepting for clouds, the sun throws full exposure to the river bluffs at my hometown of Alton, only as it also full-on illuminates the St. Charles County's fields, following the Missouri's course across the state to the other side of the world. It seems I then also learned responsibility to place. Previously, I could only look at one thing in one direction. The kid that I had been thought all that special childhood world was permanently set to were in place by the elders, those in charge. It was a complete world with river origin stories of kids like me on rafts and exploring caves, a Piasa bird plummeting to its watery death, segregated societies based on race that had their separate and parallel relationships with the river, and which were born of businesses and fortunes still tied to river trade, probably a reassuring steamboat still operated just around the bend. Even today, the city's forceful Victorian statements remain, if only temporarily, crafted on quarried portions of bluffs and sawn and carved in woodly splendor, founded into and against the city's hills. But as it is in all cities, human life is a commotion of constantly changing preoccupations that in an earlier time I couldn't recognize. With perspective, now it's easier to see that to the degree anyone is in charge, we all are deciding how we live in concert with the river world that abides. Even as late as the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries, vast, dense forests hung on in the riparian corridors along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers right here. I can't remember that, of course, but there are accounts. When I was a boy, spring and summer traveling between the two meant planning around the dusk and dawn, so as not to necessitate scrubbing off bug juice, plaster the headlamps and windscreens after returning home. Those seemingly endless insect blessings that we thought were a burden are now mostly eliminated with intensively fertilized, fumigated, and genetically engineered monocultures between the rivers and in all the other croplands. By being themselves, they fed our trophic pyramid, pollinated our food. You can see now that the watershed is smothered and poisoned. We set forth a plague of winter creeper, ailanthus, bush honeysuckle, canary grass, wheat and soy, didymo, zebra mussel, jumping carp, clawed frogs, quarrelsome starlings, even as you're trying to pronounce their names, acid rain, eutrophication, atmospheric carbon, synthetic microparticles, hormone disruptors, chemical fertilizers, plastics, petrochemicals, and our own exponentially increasing progeny, building with hubris and false permanence, paving our world out of existence to make one in our own image, to make it easy and comfortable to be fruitful and multiply. How perversely selective we are in our biblical devotions, when life before us is the book teaching the most important lessons. Realize that when Audubon describes the ease of finding imber divers, my mouth is dry, try it again, imber divers, I-M-B-E-R, not something you find much anymore in name. When he describes the ease of finding imber divers in these parts, he's referring to common loons, which are now anything but that here now. Their habitat now gone. But in Eads' expression of profound knowledge of the river, never once does he relate the density of freshwater mussels latched to its bottom, pilings, dikes, etc. That's because they were so common they didn't seem to merit mention. Everyone knew about them. They were just there and would seem to be forever. When Black Hawk's biography, the sculpture upstairs of him, when his biography implores the colonial conquerors who in taking the river and its watershed forced Fox and Sauk and the other native peoples from their land to take care of the river with the same love he had. He means all of life that has in and around the river, that which it begat and evolved. Not channelize the river, nor use it as a sewer merely for the sake of economic perversion. We're in desperate times. Our natural world, the cradle of life, is changed at our hands, and it rises to make adjustments now without our consent or consideration. The drama has only begun, and if any of the stories about our accomplishments from previous centuries are considered nice, wholesome, or sacred, then it's best to find a way to keep the nursery of our beginnings afloat a little longer. All historians should strive to become environmental historians now. Time is well spent in libraries, especially this one. Appreciate our past and navigate our future, considering what the writers said and didn't say. But take some friends and be with the river as much as you can. I'm sorry that I didn't say more about the Mighty Mississippi exhibit here. I was told to, but hopefully talking around it will do. It took 5 years. It's put together and it ran from November 2019 to June 2021. Lots of very good people helped. It was big, 6,000 square feet, over 200 artifacts. There were some wonderful virtual public programs, Ferris, and the Mercantile and marvelous artifacts. It was a good partnership and sets the stage for future collaborations. You can see a lot on YouTube if you search for the exhibit or me, and on our website, Missouri Historical Society. I look forward to more research at the Pott in the very near future. Many thanks to you, John Hoover and Nelson Spencer, for the encouragement and wisdom you bestowed, helping to set me on the right course. Many thanks to Curator Sara Hodge for her inspiration, critical mind, and piercing understanding of history's documents, paper and otherwise. Many thanks to my wife, Jane, and our daughter, Maggie, for keeping me safe in the flow, merrily rowing downstream. And to all those who have come before, like my grandmother, river artist, river laureate, much like Ruth Ferris, Margaret Davis Weber, and her great-grandparents, whose steamboat arrivals and lives of joy, sorrow, and meaning first brought our kin here. They showed the way. Matakwe Oasin, all my relations.
Wonderful contributions this year. I remember one thing, Tom, about that visit. I learned that to communicate with Ruth, you wrote to her. you know, and you're, you know, and the pen and the brushes, the pens and the brushes, and the words about river writing and river history, which is what the Wright and Swift words are all about, something that almost every writer about the rivers always understood and always will. So thank you both again. And this concludes this portion of the day. And Nelson?
I can't add anything to that. Congratulations to recipients. What a great resource they are to, in addition to the library. It's great. Sara did a terrific job on her speech. Knows more about it than I do. I tell you what. But thank you all again for coming. We'll do it again next year.